Hi everyone, in this video we'll learn about exception handling in RESTful web services using Spring Framework. First, let us understand some basics of exception. We have two types of exceptions. One, checked exceptions, and two, unchecked exceptions. Checked exceptions are those which are raised during compile time. Means when you're trying to compile your Java source file into .class file and the exception raised during compile time by the compiler are your checked exceptions. Examples are exception. Exception itself is a class in exception hierarchy in Java, and it is checked exception. Then we have class not found exception, IO exception, SQL exception, and so on. So all these are compile time exceptions. Okay. Whereas we have exceptions, those which are raised during runtime are called as unchecked exception, and these are raised by the JVM. Okay, the examples are runtime exception, null pointer exception, arithmetic exception, and so on. Okay, it is always recommended to handle checked exception and throw runtime exception. So what it means is when you're using try catch block, the argument of the catch block is always checked exception. Okay, and in the catch block, if you want to rethrow an exception, then it is always recommended to have a runtime exception. So you would have never seen a null pointer exception in the catch block, right? That means in the catch argument, like null pointer or any runtime exception. So we basically, what we do is, it's a standard that we never handle runtime exception, we throw runtime exceptions. Okay, and always handle checked exceptions, that is compile time exceptions. Hope that is clear. Next, error versus exception. Most of the time I have seen developers using these two terms interchangeably, but you need to understand that they are both different in Java. Okay, error is unchecked exception and raised during runtime, and errors cannot be recovered programmatically. So if there is an error, then we have to debug the application and see what is causing that error and try to fix it. Okay, so examples of error, we have out of memory error, stack overflow error, and so on. For client, it is always, and the issue is always an error. Okay, but technically when a developer is talking to another developer, make sure that when you're talking about error and exception, you know what you are trying to convey there. Okay, so hope that is clear. Next we have is how many ways an application can throw exceptions, or I would say that how many scenarios in which an application can throw an exception. I have divided this into three. Okay, one is the validation. That means the client is trying to send an invalid data in the request and the validation fails. In such scenario, what we do is the application throws an exception. Okay, next we have is programmatic. Here the program in the application is written such that when a certain criteria is met, okay, or a condition is met, the application throws an exception. Here the exception is manually thrown in the program. So for example, assume that the client is trying to search a record in the database which does not exist. So in that case, what we do is we manually throw the exception saying that resource not found. Okay, so that is something that is, the exception is under control, and the developer, when writing the code, okay, is well aware that that a condition is met and we have to throw the exception in the program. So that is programmatic exception. Next we have is undefined or bad program. Basically, the reason why I call it a bad program is because when writing the code, developer wasn't sure that the piece of code there is any chance of throwing an exception. Okay, so this kind of exception is thrown by the program during runtime when processing data. Okay, exception can be thrown from any part of the application. It can be thrown from controller, service, or repository. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to handle all the scenarios and return back a user-friendly response to the client. So let's step into the implementation part of exception handling. Okay, I'm in my IDE. Now what I'm going to do is first create a package, and I'll name it as exception, and create a package called exception. Okay, so now in this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class, and this class object, basically it's a response to the client. So I'll name this as API error response. And in this, I'll have a few fields that will be, we'll be using to send back to the client, and depending on those fields, client will have their own logic to handle the exception. Okay, it will be basically the information that we'll be sending back to the client. Okay, so let's create the fields. Private string error ID. This error ID is going to be used as a reference for the application team to debug the issue using the log file. Then we have private integer status. This is the HTTP status of the error or the exception that is thrown. And then we are going to have string message, and this is going to be a generic message sent back to the client. And then we're going to have a list of messages, that is error messages, and these are nothing but for example, if you have validation error, multiple validation errors, so all those validation error messages will be sent back as a list to the client. Okay, so let's import list. And next we are going to have is path, and this path is nothing but the URL the client is trying to access. Okay, that is the service URL basically. So next, what we're going to do is going to create getters and setters, and this is what we'll be sending back to all the error response or exception thrown by the application to the client. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to create a singleton class, and this is a builder class which we'll be using to create the API error response object. So let's create a class, and I'll call this as API error response builder. Okay, there's a typo. I'll just rename this to response builder. Perfect. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy paste all the fields from the API response, because this is going to be used to create the response object. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a static field of the builder class itself, and I'll call this as builder. And next I'm going to do is I have to make the constructor private, because for singleton class you need to have the constructor as private. So the object of this class cannot be created outside the class itself. So next, what we're going to do is we are going to create method to get the instance of the builder class. This will return instance, get instance method. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first check if the builder instance is the variable here, static variable, is null. If it is null, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize it. Okay, and then finally return the builder. Perfect. So that is one more thing that we have to add here is we need to make it as static. Okay, and also synchronize, because if there is a race condition between multiple thread, then there are chances of the builder class, there is a chance of creating multiple objects of it. So what we do is we make it synchronize. So we have always a single instance of builder class. So next, let's build our error response. Like before building, what we need to do is we need to have methods to set all these properties. So let's do that. Public, I'm going to do this, and let's say with error ID, and this is going to be string error ID. I'm going to do is builder dot error ID is equal to error ID, and I'm going to return builder. Okay, in the same way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it for all the other parameters here. So let's copy paste this. Okay, let's do a couple of more times, and here the next is status. So what I'm going to do is I'll make this as status, and this is type integer. Perfect. So next I'm going to do is for message. And finally for the errors. And this is going to be list. Okay, so next, the final one is the path. So let's do that too. Copy this rather. And this is going to be the, and I'll name this as for path. So it makes sense. Okay. So we have all the methods now which will be used to set the properties of the error response. So finally, let's create a method to build the response object. So for that, I'll create a method called build. This is the return type, and build. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the API error response. API error response, and here I'll do dot set error ID builder dot error ID. Set errors message. Okay, and then we have error response dot set path, and finally we have is the status. Perfect. And finally what we're going to do is we're going to return the API error response. Perfect. So now we have our builder class ready. So this is a singleton class which will be used to create our API response object. So next what we're going to do is we're going to create a global exception handler class. Okay, so let's do that. First, right click and create class, and this I'll name it as API exception handler. API exception handler. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an annotation called controller advice. This is from Spring Framework. Okay, and you can see that the name as advice. Basically, in the core implementation of controller advice uses Spring AOP, and we have concept called advice in Spring AOP, and that is how the name controller advice. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is I'm also going to extend this class with Spring response entity exception handler. The reason why using response entity exception handler is it comes with some default implementation of Spring MVC exceptions, which we can use and implement that here, so that we don't need to give those implementation, and we'll see how. Okay, so this is from Spring response entity exception handler. So let's do one thing. Okay, first here let's save this and start our server and see what response we get when we try to give some invalid validation or invalid data in the request. Okay, so we're going to go step by step. As we discussed, we have 3 scenarios: validation, programmatic, and undefined. So what we're going to do is first we're going to look at the validation exception, where client is sending us invalid data in the request. So let's do that. So open our Postman, and in this what I'm going to do is I'll first go to the post method, where I'm going to try to create a record. So here what I'm doing is I'll use capacity as negative, as we know that this is a validation exception where the negative value cannot be sent as capacity. So let's try to send and see what happens. And you can see the response body is empty. But if you go back to our IDE in the console, you can see that there is somewhere it says resolved. Okay, and you can see the method argument not valid exception. Basically, the exception is thrown and handled by our controller advice. Okay, just to prove that, let's see that. Okay, and what I'll do is I'll just comment this out. So the bean is not created for this exception handler, and let's see what exception we get. Okay, let the server restart. Now if I try to resend, and you can see that I get the validation exception that says method argument not valid exception, right? So what is happening here is now we don't have any application exception handler. Okay, so whatever exception is thrown, you can see that in the response. So by implementing a global exception here, exception handler, now what we're doing is we're handling the exception thrown by the application. Okay, and it's also always recommended that we use base packages. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the base package as the base package here. And what will happen is all the classes within this base package as well as sub packages, any exception thrown will be handled by this handler, that is controller advice class here. Okay, that's clear. Now what we're going to do is now how that exception is being handled here. If you look at the implementation of response entity exception handler, you can see that we have a method called handle exception, and this, what it is doing is handling all these exceptions. Okay, it has an annotation that says exception handler. So any exception, that is MVC exception, if you look at the description here, it says provides handling for standard Spring MVC exceptions. So for us, what we got is we got method argument not valid exception. So it was handled by this method here. Okay, so what we're going to do is if you scroll down, and you can see there's an implementation of that method, and where it is, let's scroll down, and you can see here the status that it's setting is bad request, that is 400. Okay, and what we have to do is just give the implementation for this, and then wrap our exception, convert it to API response, and send it back to the client. So let's do that. Let's go to our API exception handler, and here, if you see here, we get all those methods which we can override. So let's use the one that we just saw, the exception, that is handle method argument not valid. Okay, now let me pull this down. And now here I'm going to do is, I'm going to create the API response object. For that, first let me create, let me print some SOP or text that will confirm that the exception is handled by this method. And next, what we're going to do is we're going to create a list. Okay, list of strings. These are nothing but our errors, and get the binding result, because whatever the errors we get, okay, in the method argument not valid, the validation errors, we want to use that as errors in our API response. So let's do that. Dot get all errors. I'll use stream API and map it to get a default message. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect it. Collectors dot to list. Perfect. So what I'm doing, I'm getting all the binding result errors and mapping it to the string that is get default message, and I'm collecting as a list. Okay, I think I don't need this. Okay, perfect. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert this web request to HTTP request. So HTTP servlet, because we need our path, right, for the API response. So let's convert that to first servlet web request dot get request, and then now we have the request. This will be using to get the path. So now let's build our API response. Error response, and we will be using our builder class. Dot get instance with error ID. And error ID, what I'm going to do is, as I said, that error ID is the reference for the application team to search the log file for the issue, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the application ID. Okay, let's assume that the application ID is airline. Then I'm going to give the timestamp, that is local date time dot now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the zone offset UTC. Okay, perfect. Next, now next what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the path, and the path would be request dot get request URI. Okay, then we are going to have is with errors with message, and the message that I'm going to give is exception dot get message, and with status, and the status is going to be the one that we have here, and this is being set in our parent class in the exception entity response entity exception handler. Okay, so all we need to do is just get the value, and this is going to return the integer value of the status. Next, then finally we do is the build. So now we got the API error response object. Now this is what we're going to send back to the client. Let's copy this and we'll remove the return here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new response entity. So that is the return type. And here we're going to pass the body. This is the body of the response. And then the headers and finally the status. Okay, perfect. So now we have our very first exception handling method, and what it does, it is going to handle the handle method argument not valid exception. Okay, so let's save this and try to submit the request through Postman. So I hope you're getting here. What we're doing is there is already a handle exception method annotated with method argument not valid exception in response entity exception handler, and that method basically invokes handle method argument not valid method. What we're doing is we're just giving an override. We're giving an implementation according to what we need. We need is to create an API response object for the client. So we just we have given the implementation. That means we have overridden the method. That's it. Okay, so let's go to our Postman. First, did I save it? Yes, so let's save this. And if I go to Postman and send this, and you can see that now we get, instead of getting all those trays in the exception, now we're getting the error response, that is error ID, status, message, and errors. You can see date cannot be a future value, and here the date is future value. So we got two messages, error messages, and the path we are trying to access is the flight. So that's how we give the implementation for, that's how we handle the exception when there is an MVC exception thrown by the application. Okay, so let's try one more exception, like and here what we'll do is just let's give some valid inputs. Now only one we have is this, so let's send this and see, and you can see that the error is now date cannot be a future value. So where is this message coming from? If you go back to our DTO class here, and you can see that we have in all these annotations, that is constraint annotations, we have a message attribute that we can use that says date cannot be a future value or all the, and for capacity we have invalid capacity value. Okay, practically what we do is in real time we put this, instead of hard coding here, we read from the properties file. So what we do is all the string or the messages, we place it in a properties file and then we read it. But for now, just that we have kept it here. Fine. So hope that is clear. So let's do one more. Like let's first change this and test our valid value. And if I'm going to, I'll change this to as 8181, and let's save this. And you can see that the data was successfully saved. Okay, so let's go to get method, and here what we're going to do is we're going to search for a record where it does not exist in the database. So what happens? So let's see. Here we get an empty response. So if this is what is going to be sent to the client, an empty response for any of the record that does not exist in the database. So instead of that, what we're going to do is we're going to throw an exception. Okay, and that exception will handle it, and we'll send back a error response to the client saying that the resource was not found. Okay, so let's do that. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our controller class, and this is the method that is getting invoked. And in the service class here, and what is the method? It is invoking this get flight. Okay, so here we have an if condition that says flight is present. Else, if the flight is not present, we're going to throw a runtime exception. as I said, it's always recommended to throw a runtime exception. So since Spring 5, we have a runtime exception that we can use called as response. Let's create that. Throw new response status exception, and you can see that it has 3 constructors which we can use. We can also have a throwable. That means we can create our own runtime exception and pass it as an argument. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to use this. Okay, so let's use this, and what I'm going to do is http status dot, and I'm going to use as not found because the resource that it's trying to search is not available in the database. So I'll just say not found, and the reason I'll tell it as flight resource not found, or you can just say resource not found. Okay, perfect. So let's save this, and now if we go back to our Postman and try to resubmit and see, let's see what happens. And you can see that now we get an exception. The application is throwing an exception. It says flight resource not found. Okay, and the status is 400. So now let's handle this in our API exception handler. What we're going to do is we're going to create a method, and the method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a public method, and I'll name this as handle. First, let's create the response entity of API error response. Handle response status exception. Response status exception, and I'll also use the servlet request. Okay, and next what I have to do is I have to use an annotation exception handler and use the same exception that we have as an argument here, that is our response status exception. So now what we have to do is let's copy a few of the lines from here. First thing is this, just to make sure that we are in that method, and then create the list of string, that is our errors, and here it's going to be as list, and here I'll just use the get reason because that is what we passed as an argument in our service class. Okay, next is let's create our API response. Let's copy it from here. Okay, and this is going to be my request, and this is going to be the get status dot value. Okay, and that's it. We got our API response object, and this is what we're going to return. So let's take this, copy it from here, and we don't need this. What we can do is we can just take the get status, and the return type here is this. Perfect. So now let's go back to our Postman and try to do a get request and see what happens. Here, let's click on send, and you can see that now we get API response, right, where we have the error ID status and the message, and the message for in the errors we have as flight resource not found, and this is something that we sent we passed as the argument in our service class here. Yeah, right. Again, this comes from the properties file or some static file, but it's never recommended that we have as hard coded here. Okay, so that's how we can keep on adding all other exceptions like MVC exceptions. Let's look at one more, that is constraint violation. In that, what we're going to do is, for example, here if I give negative value, let's see what happens. You can see that we're getting constraint violation exception, right, for the get method. If you pass negative flight ID, then we have to handle this. So let's do that. So all these are Spring MVC exceptions which we are handling, and this is again that falls into our very first scenario, that is validation exception. So let's go back here and add the implementation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this all together from the method here, and I'm going to put this as constraint violation exception, and the same I'll pass as an argument here. Okay, and next I'm going to also change the method name, constraint violation exception. Okay, perfect. So let's copy this, and here what I'm going to do is, as an array, I'll just give more description here. There are, because constraint violation can have a list of error messages. So let's loop over it, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an array list, and next what I'll do is I'll loop over the exceptions here, violations, and it is a constraint for each violation in the constraint violations within the exception. What I'm going to do is I'm looping over it, errors dot add, and what I'm going to do here is violation dot get message. Okay, so I'm adding that into the errors. So we got the errors. Next, what we're going to do is we are going to create our API response. So again, it's going to be the same errors, and the only change here is going to be the status. So what we're going to do, we're going to use the HTTP status dot, and this is going to be if you look at the the return type here, the status is 500, and this is something that is coming from the client side, that is invalid data. So we have to convert this to 400 series. Okay, that is bad request. Okay, so let's convert this to a bad request status. Okay, and finally what we are doing is we are using the same here. Perfect. So now what we have done is we have a handler method for constraint violation exception. So let's save this and let the server restart. Okay, it's now restarted. Let's go to our Postman and try to resubmit. Now you can see that we get a error response that has errors, path, error ID, and status and message. Okay, so this is how we we can handle all our validation exceptions and send back a user-friendly response to the client. Okay, instead of sending back all the stack trace, all the technical terms related to exceptions. So what we are doing is we are converting that to a more informative and more meaningful message and sending back to the client. So one thing you need to remember, the error ID is something that will be used by the application team to debug the issue, okay, and search in the log file. Okay, so hope that is clear, and let's move on to our next scenario, that is programmatic. So as I said that if the user is trying to search a record, and if the record does not exist, then we throw an exception, right? And I think we already saw that scenario, okay, and that is this. Okay, that is nothing but response status exception. So this is our second scenario where the exception is programmatically thrown by the program in our service class. So let's go to our service class, and you can see that what we have done, we have thrown the exception here, right? So let's do the same thing. Let's copy this. I think we also have somewhere to do, yes, where we are trying to update the flight record in the database. And first what we are doing is we are trying to search if the record exists in the database. If it exists, then we update, else we throw the exception. And the same thing, what we do is we also have delete flight. So let's put it here also. Perfect. So that's how we implement the programmatic exception. You can have another example, like if you're trying to save a record, and when trying to create a record which is already present in the database, then what you can do is you can throw an exception saying that record already exists. Okay, for example, here when creating the flight, if the flight number, okay, exist in the database, then what we do is we throw an exception. Okay, so that way it can be, you can implement your own exception. You can throw any programmatic exception depending on your requirements. So I hope that is clear. And now what happens if, apart from any of this, okay, the validation or programmatic exception, if the application fails processing any data, that can be controller, service, or repository. Okay, the repository we don't give the implementation, but if anything happens when executing the query, okay, in such scenario what we do is we give a global implementation that handles all the exception, okay, other than what we have handled here. For that, what we are going to do is we are going to create a method that will handle our exceptions, means all the exceptions that are not handled in any of our methods. And that is our third scenario, that is undefined, or called as bad program exception. So for that, let's create a method called public, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to return same here, API response, and this is going to handle exception. Okay, and I'll just copy this and I annotate this with perfect. So next what I'm going to do is I'll just use the same thing, that is I'll copy the entire method from here and copy paste this, and instead of an list, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use and this is what the message. Okay, so I have the errors and I also have the API error. Now the HTTP status is going to be internal. This is going to be 500. okay, the status whenever there is something that is thrown by the application, like which is not defined, Okay, define, I mean, if when processing the data, if an exception is thrown, what we do is we give it as internal server error, that is 500. The same thing we are going to put it here. Perfect. So now we have a method that will handle all our exceptions, okay, apart from something that we have not handled here, okay, a global exception. So to demo it, what we are going to do is we are going to do something in the service class. Okay, so let's go to our service class here, and let's try to put something in the get flight. Okay, and this might seem a little stupid here, but just assume that you have hundreds of lines of code in the service class, and somewhere programmer missed the logic that it might throw an exception and did not add that particular logic in try catch. An exception is thrown. In that scenario, what will happen is that exception will be caught in our API exception handle method, that is handle exception. Okay, but to demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. I'm going to try to perform some operation here. That is, I'll just call this capacity. Okay, and what exception we are going to get here? We're going to get a null pointer exception. Okay, so let's save this. Just assume that there are multiple hundreds of lines of code here, and somewhere there is a line that is going to throw you a null pointer or any runtime exception. Okay, let's see how this is going to be handled. Let's go to our get method, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some value here, and if I try to send, let's see what happens. And you can see that it was handled in our handle exception method, and the null pointer exception was handled in our handle exception method, and we got an user-friendly response which will be sent back to the client. The status is 500 and we have the message as null. Okay, you can give any message here saying that, okay, instead of having just null, we can just do here is, let's go back to our handler here and let's use the same message here. Instead of that, what I'm going to do is dot, I'm going to use it as get reason is, or let's see what it returns. Okay, if I click send again, yeah, internal server error. Okay, so that's how we implement exception handling, and you can find different implementation of exception handling in application to application. If you're trying to I have seen multiple applications where they use their own exception handling logic. Okay, but this is something that you will often find when using Spring. There will be a controller device, and we can now use response entity exception handler because this class has few implementation, that is Spring MVC exception implementation, that we can just override and wrap our exception to the response and then send it back. Okay, and we also saw the global exception, how we can handle, and also we used an exception, a runtime exception, that is response status exception is a runtime exception from Spring 5, and this is something that when we programmatically throw an exception, we can handle it and wrap it to our API response object. Okay, this way you can from this you can give your own implementation of this controller class here at controller device. And one more thing that you can do here is, as this is a REST application, you can use REST controller advice. Okay, so what it is, it's basically a combination of controller advice has plus response body. So that means the return type, you don't need to wrap it into a response entity. All you can do is you can just return back the object itself. Okay, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep both. That's fine, but just to know that we have something called REST controller device. If you don't want to return, you don't want to wrap your API response, that is API response into response entity, you can just use REST control advice. So I hope that is clear. You can use this technique or this class and implement your own exception handling. Okay, but I hope it's clear, and how you can handle exceptions in all the three scenarios: validation, programmatic, and as well as any undefined or global exceptions. That's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next session.